My name is Kenneth Dean. I'm the head of the Chinese Studies Department here, and I've been studying Singapore Chinese temples, Henghua temple networks in Southeast Asia, Nanyang Chinese in modern Chinese history, Taoist studies, that kind of thing. And I have a website that you're welcome to look at called Singapore Historical GIS, shgis.nus.edu.sg. Now, we have representatives of the publishers here today, and they will be presenting copies of the book after the presentation. You're welcome to join, and hopefully Alvin will agree to sign some of these books. So that's a nice opportunity for you to pick up a copy of the book after the presentation. That's Christy and Clara from Rutledge. Thank you. It's sold at a discount today of only 99 net, which is a bit, these books these days. Anyway, I won't say anything more about that. But I do hope that the library will order a e-copy of the book. I picked up the paper copy, but I think we should have an e-copy available for all the students who I think will be assigned this book in the future, or certainly chapters from it. So I will ask the audience to speak into mics during the question and answer afterwards to allow for better audio. They're trying to record this presentation. And if you need to use the facilities, you can go out the back door and come back in that way. So that would be much appreciated. So without further ado, I think I'll invite Alvin up here. He's the assistant professor with the Theater Studies program in the Department of English Language and Literature at NUS. His key research interests are popular religious practices, spirit mediums and rituals, with an emphasis on new media and digital technology. He's the Deputy Director of Technology and Online Editor in Mandarin of the Asian Shakespeare Intercultural Archive, which is a very important digital platform here at NUS. He's also editor of the Theater Makers of Asia Archive. All of this is part of the Asian Intercultural Digital Archives project that aims to make some of the most important contemporary theater practices in Asia available and accessible online to a wide audience. Dr. Lim has published on Singapore theater, religious practices, and digital archiving. He's also a member of the After Performance Working Group, which explores experimental modes of writing on performance and co-authorship. So please join me in welcoming Professor Lim to make a presentation on his new book. Thank you.
It's a bit high. A very good afternoon to you all. Thank you for attending this book launch. I'm very humbled by your presence and support. I'd first like to thank the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, especially Andrew and Pravena from the Research Division for working hard to make this event possible. I would also like to thank Professor Phillips, who was my supervisor on my PhD, Professor Kenneth Dean, who just introduced me, and Professor Daniel Goh for agreeing to respond to my work, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and responses to the book. I'll begin with a very brief introduction to the book and cover some of the key ideas. What I also aim to do is to supplement the book by showing you some documentation, so there will be some videos, some photographs. After all, video recording can somewhat substitute an experience of the life, and does so differently from a book. It is also inevitable that research into popular performance and academic writing about contemporary religion cannot quite catch up with the practice itself. When the book is finally published, the practice might have already moved on or have new innovations that the writing did not anticipate. But I think having worked through questions about mediumship and mediation and the context of popular religion in Singapore, I hope this book will give us some sort of a foundation to understand how mediation performs in a religious context. This book was first conceived as a PhD project in 2010, almost 9 years ago. At that time, I first met my main informant. He had just started his Facebook account. He was adding friends who were connected to his daughter. a good friend of mine, and he added me. Okay, I know it sounds a bit kind of awkward that someone's friend's father is adding me on Facebook, but we actually met a few times, and I knew he was religious, but what caught my attention at the time was he was in fact a blogger, and he posted updates and announcements and documentation of his religious activities at a private temple. This temple will later be a very important site for this research. But I'll come back to that in a bit. Okay? This was 2010. Facebook was relatively new, and my generation was using Blogger, LiveJournal, WordPress, and some of you might even have had a Friendster account. If you got Friendster, I'm sure some of you know what Friendster is, right? This was before Instagram, was before TikTok, Snapchat. Not many of you know these platforms, but those are the new platforms that we have now, right? And I was really very fascinated at the time by my informant's level of attention and tech savviness. He's about 60 over years old now, but he was very tech savvy. He knew what to do with all these social media platforms. And the spirit media of this private temple that he was documenting was actually his godfather. And he had for a very long time been an assistant who stood beside him as they carry out the rituals. So he assisted with talismans, he translated and interpreted his godfather when he speaks to the temple devotees, and he also documented the rituals with his photographs and video recordings. So instinctively I felt that this practice, or what Heidi Campbell, who is an American scholar who talks about religion and new media, had a very profound implications on the way we practice our religion. I myself am a Christian, and going to church, I witnessed throughout the years the shift towards the digital, right? In many aspects of performance. So this includes the live broadcast of sermons, the wide distribution of podcasts, daily devotional messages, pastor's prayers sent to your emails, and how about cell groups, praying for each other in WhatsApp groups, right? So now, more so than 10 years ago, religion is now mobilized through new technologies. And in some respect, we take for granted in Singapore the availability of this form of mediation. So 9 years ago, I decided to attend to this process of digital mediation, particularly in the context of popular religion in Singapore. I was also attempting to anticipate how religion will be performed in the future. In fact, I didn't have much to work with. I didn't quite know what religious festivals to study, curiosity, and because my father used to go to the Nine Emperor Gods Temple, I attended the Nine Emperor Gods Festival at Choa Chu Kang Tok Mukong in 2010. I think the following year I met Professor Kenneth Dean in one of the festivals, so I think Fabian was also there a few times. Right? I'm not sure you even recognized me at that time. But this was a time when I had a video camera. I couldn't afford like DV tapes because the festival would run on for many hours and my battery always ran out, so I could not get a full documentation of the 9 days of festival. But what I had instead was the fact that after the festival, I decided to call the temple, and they told me that they actually produced DVDs. So what I did was to call up the videographer and ask, do you have a DVD? Yes, I do, but I need to sell you for $10. So I paid the money and I actually have a copy now. So if you're interested, you might want to have a look at this. It's an important document because now the festival is being performed in a very different way than how it was documented 9 years ago. So fast forward 9 years, I'm going to quickly show you what I've been doing so far. It's my new research. What I've been doing so far is to actually save pages of live streaming. So this is what I mean by books not being able to catch up with the practice, because what Nine Emperor Gods Festival, for example, has been doing a lot is actually doing live streaming. So this in particular, yeah. So this is like a live streaming of this is Choa Chu Kang Tok Mukong, when they do live streaming. Someone will be there with the camera. I'm ready to kind of film the procession. So temples and devotees are now directly involved in documentation and dissemination of spirit processions through live streaming on Facebook. And here's the list, as I've showed you. And this is what I mean when I say a book cannot always cover each new innovation. So for my next project, hopefully I can write on this whole new phenomenon. So the realms, as Stuart Hoover back in 2006 wrote, the realms of religion and new media can no longer be easily separated. This was around a time when religious studies and media studies began to... I forgot to show you the slides. It's okay. Began to sort of study the intersections of new media and religion. In the past decade, you see a list of books in the past decade. This is not the whole comprehensive list, I'm just showing a selection. There's a burgeoning growth in academic literature on religion and new media, but not so much about popular Taoist practices. As more spirit mediums create Facebook profiles online, something that Christian pastors are really good at. I'm just going to quickly show you such a profile. There's a need to study this phenomenon in greater detail. Often this subfield of religious studies focuses on the impact and significance of digital technology and new media on religion. Informed by this area of research, my own work looked at something else altogether. I examined the significance of spirits and luminous beings on digital technology. This perspective is by design. How does digital technology help us to think about ancient spiritual and divine beings that still wear costumes and hold objects imagined to be from the ancient world? While scholars of religious studies often discuss contemporary expressions of religious beliefs and knowledge in terms of new media's transformative properties or as context for the reception of religious meaning, the synthesis of spiritual beings to digital technology deserves critical attention. In other words, what I think the book attempts to do is to express what being digital means to spiritual forms of religious practice. By locating the many assemblage points of being digital and being spiritual as observed in popular religion in Singapore, the discussion leads to explicating the interactions between entangled mediums in a religious context. On the one hand, contemporary offerings of religion heavily incorporate digital technology because of its prevalence in society. On the other hand, such religions already have the numen or potential to involve technological mediation in materializing their spirits and gods. Conceived in theatrical terms, a religious event can be understood as the gathering of media to sensorially and corporally point to a performer who has an audience, and both the performer and the audience member can evoke a spiritual presence. The combination of digital and spiritual may suggest an analysis of the immaterial as wholly separate realm of existence. After all, the adjectives digital and spiritual may sound like they belong to a description of the non-physical. However, digital spirits as a religious phenomenon is about the bleeding into both the immaterial and material realms of experience. When digital, it suspends this material-immaterial opposition and offers both the trace and the imprint of a spiritual being carrying out certain acts with humans, through humans, or beyond humans. It concretizes in the embodied material features of lived religion, where the spiritual is also implicated in a digitally encoded practice. In fact, the spiritual in contexts are examined and entwined in digital frameworks because they mutually support multiple manifestations. Without the digital, spirits are contained, whereas by being digital, they can exist beyond their physical vessels. Simultaneously embodied and digital, spirits and deities coexist and co-perform their presence during religious performances. My use of spirits and spiritual has a twofold purpose. First, it denotes an availability of a spirit or a spiritual being involved in the mediating process. Second, it recognizes the intangible existence of spiritual agencies or spiritualities that make other people act. And I think this quote from Bruno Latour is Reassembling the Social, where he asks sociologists to, these are real things, these are things that we should study. But for those in the audience who grew up in Chinese families, you might know what I'm talking about. when I speak of spirits who are immanent and everywhere, or perhaps you might have seen authors with multiple effigies of deities that remind us of their existence. In the context of Hungry Ghost Month that just started a week ago, maybe what's not critically examined is how these deities and spirits still perform in contemporary society. So here I'm going to quickly run you through some of my case studies. I'm sorry I can't cover every case study in the book. I'm just going to show you very quickly 3 case studies. So chapter 2 begins with my meetings with my informant, Uncle Chong, that's the name I usually call you. In the book, Uncle Chong performs the multiple roles of a spirit medium, a spirit storyteller, a medium, an interviewee, and my mentor as I attempted to make sense of his religious practice. He's a subject of interest because of his experience as a tuoto, which can be literally translated as head of the table. Uncle Chong speaks several languages, Chinese languages, and acts as an interpreter for devotees when the spirit medium is possessed by a monkey god, and speaks in Hokkien while answering a devotee's question. He is also a blogger, as I mentioned, and through Uncle Chong I gained insights into the nuances and particularities of his religious life. Our conversations draw attention to the problem of religious representation and the complexities of mediumship. So first you have this spirit medium who is the physical sort of spirit vessel for his deity. And then you have Uncle Chong, who is the spirit medium's translator, who stands by the side at the distance, and makes sense of trance-possession and explains the deity's speech to the devotee, even though he sometimes fails to understand the message. So that as he goes along, he's actually making up the message because he doesn't quite catch what the spirit medium is saying. And finally, you have the archivist, which is me, who archives this dialogues, who translates this experience and write them in this book. So in the book, you will see me having conversations with Uncle Chong as well as the spirit medium. In a nutshell, Uncle Chong's practice evokes multiple worlds: the divine world, spirits and gods, the virtual world, the internet, and the immediate physical world. Uncle Chong describes an interface where multiple actors come into play in an organic way. He, like the anointed spirit medium, straddles more nodes of interactions between gods, humans, objects, and virtual entities. While it's common to think about religious objects, talismans, effigies, spirit mediums as mere copies or simulations of an abstract or transcendental and original God, I suppose due to the deeply entrenched Judeo-Christian theological understanding in Western discourse, the example I'm talking about today are not mere copies, but each a lived instance of a spiritual presence. So Uncle Chong kindly agreed to bring me to his temple. That's the sign in front of this 3-room flat. I'm not going to tell you where it is because it's private and it's probably illegal as well. And so he often observes and records the temple rituals. And the temple is called Hua Ko San Gong, which loosely translated as flower, fruit, mountain palace. If those familiar with Tian Da Shui Wu Su Kong would know what this means. What is the mountain paradise that he lives with his monkey minions. And I'm going to show you very quickly a video clip of his godfather while possessed by the monkey god. So some things to note. Because the spirit medium was 80 years old at the time of recording, he no longer performs the more acrobatic stance that monkey god spirit mediums are usually known to perform. And Dr. Strange talk about this in his new project. He is working on monkey gods, so he would know more about that sort of acrobatic stance that I'm talking about here. But in this case, my focus is on this aged body who still has to maintain that possession. And so what he does is sort of scaled down version of what he used to do. So there are no more sort of mutilations. They used to use an axe and chop themselves and pierce themselves. So there's no blood involved now. Nevertheless, when Mr. Wu performs the monkey god, he assemblages multiple signifiers from a multitude of sources. I go into greater detail about the deity in the book, but those familiar would know that the monkey god is actually a fictional character in the 16th century novel Journey to the West, or CUT. Otherwise, other people, like I mentioned, Dr. Shree, would be familiar with the historical sources and temples that worship the monkey god as their main deity. Just now when you saw this, and I asked Uncle Chong and I asked Mr. Wu what that means, he actually don't know. They don't actually know the actual meaning, but they have been doing it for years and years. It's sort of default sign that they gesture. And if you compare with other monkey god spirit mediums, they might have a different sort of gesture to kind of denote the fact that the body has been possessed by a god. So this is an older picture of him in his 30s when he was still doing this sort of bodily mutilations. And I always find that, there's a commentary where when I compare this with like the vegetarian festival in Phuket, for example, they really do the sort of piercing. In Singapore, a lot of this sort of spirit possession are very mild compared to what they do in Phuket. So at Hua Bo Shan Kong in Singapore, the monkey god is a true and divine being to the devotees. The temple's name is derived from the mountain paradise that Sun Wukong created for himself and his monkey minions, recontextualized by Uncle Chong's godparents to the state-built three-room flat in Singapore. The temple sits alongside flats belonging to families of different religions and ethnicities. As an effigy, the deity sits on the temple altar alongside his other avatars and the other deities, an interface that gathers the deities in a structured order. As a human body, the deity possesses the spirit medium while seated at the table. Uncle Chong also blogs about and records the temple rites, and through the blog, this process is captured as an archive. Uncle Chong says, I don't actually believe that my camera can capture the spirit. It's really just to keep a record. I too do not actually think that the spirit is captured on video when one records the procession rite. Nevertheless, there are implications to carrying out this form of archiving. The personal archive extends the religious to another platform by which new audiences can view his documentation, and he further posts images of the rituals on Facebook, and they garner some likes and comments. And Uncle Chong's blog of his temple records the religious events and festivals and represents them as images, narratives, and video recordings. The blog interface concentrates writing, pictures, and videos in a single surface, highlights both the end of the previous live performance as well as its future repetition on another platform in another context. Uncle Chong gives an account of the live performance, acts as interpreter or spokesman, but most of all, he signposts after the event the interventions performed by the spirit medium for the devotees. His godfathers simultaneously possess the signifiers, monkey god, Taoism, and Hua Po Shan Kong, but relies on hybridized signifiers from multiple sources to perform the spirit possession. Extending this argument, Uncle Chong's labor on the digital co-produces and recreates the scene of the god-human possession in an organized digital interface of figures, gathering digital data of the live procession. The blog highlights the substitutions made between gods, their figures and icons, and the human participants that articulate the exchange just between gods and humans. At the gathering of religious signs during the procession video that you just watched, the blog also gathers the signs and reproduces digital copies of the spirit possession. The digits possess the deity appropriating the monkey god for a different archive. When the godson writes about his godfather who is possessed by the god, this chain of signification from live to the digital already animates the estrangement from the god, the truth of the thing itself, and the truth of speech, and the truth that is open to future performance. Is this still not monkey god? How is this monkey god different from the monkey god of another temple on another part of the island? How is it on the birthday of monkey god the spirit can multiply and simultaneously appear in many other temples? In this case, how can it appear in many different versions of monkey god on a YouTube channel? Uncle Chong and the monkey god temple hint at this progression of religion, progression from ritual repetition to online documentation, where spiritual experience is being re-disseminated online. It opens up to future adaptation that learns from this archive. And in the next case study, this potential is fully embraced, where the rituals evolve precisely because digital technology can multiply the presence of the spirit. In 1902, a Hokkien businessman from Singapore, Ong Chu Ki, went to the Nine Emperor Gods temple in Penang. He prayed for his business to succeed and brought home a talisman from the temple. His wish was realized, and he reciprocated by installing an amulet of the gods in his family altar. Later, he had a dream where an old man instructed him to build a temple dedicated to the Nine Emperor Gods. This was how the first temple of the Nine Emperor Gods was established in Singapore. Since then, worshippers staged an annual float parade to celebrate the gods' birthdays. The Jiuhuang Yedan, or the Nine Emperor Gods Festival, takes place over the first 9 days of the 9th lunar month, normally in October. I need to check what month it is this year. It celebrates the birthday of the Nine Emperor Gods with elaborate rituals and processions, and begins with a ceremony to invite the gods from the sea, and ends with the gods departing on the last night. Since 2010, I've been studying this semiotic tour de force and participated in their processions. The spirituality of the Nine Emperor Gods can be described as dispersed yet connected, as the deities are believed to be contained in different vessels, human mediums and objects such as tablets, amulets and palanquins in different locations simultaneously. The contemporary version of the festival now engages with digital media, and most devotees are armed with smartphones and tablets, ready to upload their gods to a social media platform. Information, messages, videos, and images of gods are documented, reproduced, disseminated online, and these resources are shared and manifested in different formats across different platforms and at an ever-increasing speed. Participants of the festival make those documentations of the gods available online, and this presents implications to how the festival is now received, understood, and performed. More significantly, even back in 1902, a copy was all needed for the gods to reproduce themselves in Singapore. More than a decade ago, before YouTube or video networks were created, it would have been difficult to find a video documentation of donkey worship and their rituals, but now any simple search of donkey on Google or YouTube will result in multiple results. Here I would like to show you some documentation. Of when a supposed traditional practice meets the digital, when the codes and symbols of Taoist 8 trigrams meet the binary codes and ones and zeros that form the foundation of the digital cameras and smartphones. More ostensibly, the main prayer to the Jade Emperor is followed by a flurry of photos of the possessed mediums taken by professional photographers, temple members, and members of the public. Comparing the 2010 festival with the 2013 and 14 festivals, digital technology can now be described as being directly involved in the ritual process. The 9 spirit mediums walk back to the inner temple and pose for a photograph. The ease with which the whole ritual incorporates the presence of cameras and the deliberate posing of the spirit mediums is evidence of the evolving nature of the ritual. In the period of 2 years, there's an increased presence of video cameras that deliberately work into the performance. The videographers hired by the temple and amateur photographers skillfully position themselves at every ritual at every stage of the ceremony. The birth scene is an agglomeration of recording technology and religious practice. After the photographs are taken, the gods stagger towards the temple exit created by a temple assistant. This video shows a significant moment where we see evidence of digital technology's influence on the movement of spirit mediums, people, and what used to be only directed by spiritual rites. So if you see the moment where the flag was raised because it's time for a photograph. More recently, at the site of when the gods depart to the sea, the temple reproduced the festival with a bird's eye view of the procession, a view that extends to the digital realm. I should be careful to say that this is not so much a God's eye view of the festival, but at least it offers a sort of alternate view of the festival, and also it's also done to sort of promote the festival to like the younger generation, and go to YouTube and you can easily use hashtag and they can see the highlights quite easily. I think they still continue to do this, more so now with the live streaming. What if, I'm going to move on to the next case study, but what if digital spirit as a concept is taken to the most extreme? What happens when it is believed that one can become a digital spirit? And I explored this question in chapter 5, which I still think is the hardest chapter to write because of its tragic nature. On 23rd August 2008, Singapore's Mandarin evening newspaper Le Wan Bao reported the suicides of two teenagers that occurred around 5:20 a.m. Titled Ji Tong Yi Hao Yo, or Spirit Medium and Good Friend. The report gave an illustrated account of the incident, which included a description and photographs of the surrounding area where the bodies were. It was a vivid picture of two 16-year-olds, Ku Itaya and Xia Chang-ho, jumping off a building to their deaths, apparently from the 9th level where Ku Itaya's bedroom was. Reporters who arrived at the scene were able to find a diary lodged between some pipes outside Ku Itaya's apartment, and in the diary was a final suicide note stating explicitly that he was going to end everything. The day before he wrote, and I quote, "There is still 0 days and it will be the World War," end quote. Later, reporters found that Ku Itaya had convinced at least one of his friends, Xiao Chang-ho, that if they were to take their lives, they would come back as what he called slayers, digital gods that resemble the avatars of a Chinese game called Slayers. His groups used to play games like Warcraft as well as Slayers. So you see on the left it's now defunct, so you now cannot log in and play this game. But Warcraft is still a very kind of popular game. So each of his friends actually had an avatar and a Chinese name of general, deity, and Ku was also a temple spirit medium. He learned this to conduct spirit possessions from his grandmother, who was I don't think she was registered, but she was also working in a spirit medium in a private temple. So Ku and Vitaya would also visit him at this temple and witness Vitaya being possessed by different deities. And so Ku and his friends would also be familiar with the choosing of characters or avatars before the start of a new game in a massively multiplayer online role-playing game or MMORPG. In that chapter, I compared the characteristics of online video games with particular emphasis on the notion of avatars and character building to the spirit possessions carried out in Vitaya's private temple. I also sought to understand how or why Ku Vitaya was determined to remove physical restrictions and conceive his theory to abandon the world and his human body in order to reappear as a digital slayer. Having experienced extra-human strength through his spirit possessions in the HDB temple, Vitaya believed in the possibilities of attaining an even higher state of godhood. What if Vitaya could progress beyond the physical limitation and remove the body entirely? The virtual body meets the spirit, and all limitations that the body has are removed. The spirit and spirit medium relation during a spirit possession is further blurred when Vitaya fused the virtual space of Slayers or Warcraft into his concept of spirit and produced and produce its own brand of virtual play. There is the ability to use virtual commands to execute godly powers online. To end, I just want to reiterate some of the key concepts in the book. In my first chapter, as well as the conclusion, I asked what it means for religion to act digitally. To act digitally implies the performativity of the practicing of doing of religion and the labor that goes behind the doing of it. It also implies how the doing makes religion work, how the immaterial is made material, and how the imperceptible is made perceptible. Hence, the core focus of the research is the study of mediums as trace, and medium across medium as information, data, and codes pass from one medium to another. When mediums perform and mediate, what is altered, what remains, and what is lost. The focus for me is about the circulation of religious practice and the entities that make possible the circulation. It's also the corporeal extensions that support the embodiment of the spiritual, and the most literal way a speech act or gesture can perform the digital spirit. At the same time, I'm aware of the invisible and often inexplicable absences of spiritual beings made visible through spirit mediums, sacred objects, and religious behavior. In that sense, being digital is also an expression of hidden aspects. To use a contemporary analogy, being digital involves specific programming languages and codes to build a surface or image as we interact with the digital. An interface such as our web browsers hides the codes and helps to process them into legible contents. Further, the computer capable of making calculations and binary progressions at great speed processes these layered interfaces before the content makes its appearance. Mediums ensure the circulation of meaning when in performance, both immediate and intimate to the participant of the performance, while insisting upon the customs and conventions of its tradition and heritage. It is here that I must thank and acknowledge the kindness of many who impart their knowledge to me as I observe their practices. I conclude that my work on digital spirits is really about the extensions of the body. When we extend religious performance to the digital, we discover that all along we have been technologically extending our gestures, our signs, and our performances in digital and performative ways that God manifests because we mediate it with our extensions. However, digital spirits is also about the digital extensions of digits taking on a life of themselves and forcing us to rethink how religion is now performed. Thank you for your attention.
I feel very privileged to be here, and I'm very pleased to see this publication after all this time. I remember after Alvin had begun this project, I think it must have been in 2011, I went to a conference in Taiwan, the Association of Philosophy and Literature, and couldn't bear the sessions by Saturday, so went out into the streets, and suddenly, without any kind of fanfare, a performance began to take place in the street around me. Of course, the first thing I did is to take out my camera, my digital camera, and begin to photograph this incredible performance, which is a Taoist performance taking place around about June, in a way that seemed to be manifesting itself in the streets in Taiwan in the most kind of everyday fashion, with traffic just being stopped in its process, people wandering the streets, stopping to observe what was going on, and then participate in certain ways in what was going on. I remember thinking about this afterwards, and thinking about Alvin's work, and thinking about how Alvin's work was going to begin to help not just explain the process that I was observing there, but also to begin to relate that process to the everyday in general. And what I wanted to say to begin with, I've got a few things to say. We'll try to get through them all in 15 minutes. What I wanted to say to begin with was that I think this is quite an important book, quietly, without fanfare. I think it's quite an important book in several ways, and I'll just try to cover what those are. The first thing I wanted to say was that while it is based in theatre, it acknowledges that it's partly an ethnographic work. It participates in continental philosophy, in archaic Chinese philosophy and religion, and gets stuck into technology and new media. As the supervisor of a project like this is a pain in all sorts of ways. You know, what kind of field are we addressing here? So one of the questions that I very gently put to Alvin from time to time. But we shouldn't play these backgrounds down in any way. They're brought to bear with a light touch in this book, a deceptively light touch. I mean, when I first came across Alvin's work, he was an MA student years ago. The first thing I thought was, you know, if he ever gets this knowledge together in some way, this is going to produce amazing work. There's a breadth of understanding, a breadth of knowledge that you don't see very often. And it's culminated in this book. But again, with a light touch, a deceptively light touch. The continental philosophy alone, and I think this has its place and is in a way present throughout the book. In each chapter, it plays a certain role. And perhaps I'll say a little bit about that in relation to the other things as I go on. But it's an extraordinary achievement to be able to work at this level, which is why this book is addressed as much to theatre as it is to continental philosophy, as it is to ethnographers, and as it is indeed to people interested in technology and digital technology in particular. It has something to say to all of these fields, but doing so on its own terms. The second point I wanted to make is the position of the book, its modality of enunciation, if you like, its discourse, its discursive ground, situated between, using terms that I've borrowed from Alvin's books here, chapters, between abstraction and the empirical. Now, that sounds easy. Well, it's not, because I think in what he's just said now, there's a bleeding of one into the other, such that there's a moment where it becomes undecidable, where you're dealing with the spirit and where you're dealing with the manifestation, if you like, of the spirit. And I think this situated between what we very easily call abstraction on the one hand and the empirical on the other is a great achievement of this book. And I'll try and say a little bit more about this. I think of this book as, please forgive me, Alvin, a phenomenology of spirit for the 21st century. Phenomenology, first of all, because of the concern with subjective experience. And I think this is what's remarkable about this book, is that it's not just the experience of the observer, like me in Taiwan taking pictures of something I don't quite understand, but am impressed by. No, it's the role that the writer of this work takes in not just understanding subjective experience, but reproducing that understanding in a kind of subjective experience itself. This is phenomenology of a certain kind, and we should maybe qualify that slightly as we go on. The concern with subjective experience and the phenomenology of that experience. This is what governs and guides this book from beginning to end, as I understand it. Now, the ability to grasp experience in this case is explicitly presented as a kind of theatrical knowledge. It's a knowledge of theatricality. It is basically where theatre is grounded. That ability to present something, to take a role, and to make that role so convincing that the audience too takes on that understanding and that experience. This is fundamentally theatrical, as I understand it. And this departs from most of the kind of mainstream Western notions of phenomenology. but not in the words of, say, Jacques Derrida, who is also one of the presences, along with Uncle Chong, in this book. Phenomenology grounds itself as a theatre scene, the words of Jacques Derrida. And in a way, this is the theatre of the phenomenology of subjective experience of the spirit. Which is kind of a mouthful, but this is what I'm saying about this book. It presents something quite extraordinary. So, it's phenomenology, but it's also empiricism. But this kind of empiricism is also quite difficult to do, because if one accepts that the subjective experience that we're talking about is the experience of something invisible, using Alvin's own words, undecidable, uncertain, then the empirical is more than empirical. It's very difficult to put this in words. It's a radical kind of empiricism that goes beyond the straightforwardly empirical, and you cannot rely on empiricist principles or empirical principles to get this kind of work done. There's not much more I can say about that, certainly in the time, and I think anyone who has not yet read Alvin's book needs to get down and do that straight away to find out how this beyond the empirical operates. I can say one or two things about it while I have a little bit of time. But I wanted to get back to another thing that I believe is important about this book. That's the everydayness of the experience that we're talking about, the everydayness of the mediation of spirits. And this comes back through all the chapters in Alvin's book. There's something mundane in the best possible sense of that word. There's something about the everyday that is captured. And certainly, Singapore is not like Taiwan in the sense that the streets suddenly overflow unexpectedly. It's slightly more constrained, perhaps. Certainly, it's organised socially in a different way. But nonetheless, what we are talking about is something that in the streets of Singapore makes something of the everyday extraordinary. And I think much of the work in this book deals with that. But mediation, the everydayness of the mediation of spirits, opens out the concept of mediation considerably, but keeps it in check in a certain way. And I think it's important to think about this. First of all, as Alvin was speaking just now, I couldn't help thinking of Plato and his denigration of the rhapsode, whose divine inspiration ends up in performance. And of course, Plato distrusted and perhaps even feared the effect of this. Turning it around, something else, a different kind of knowledge, a knowledge that is not specifically knowledge. And I couldn't help acknowledging Alvin's point. The translation isn't necessarily that certain of what's being translated, but it goes ahead and does it anyway. I think this is a really important aspect of Alvin's concept of mediation, where the mediated element is in the moment and altered. It's conveyed, it's passed on, and it is altered by the agent of that mediation. And again, this is another theatrical point, and it's a point about the repeatability of theatrical performance. So, mundane religious practice as repetition. This is easy to say, but more difficult to work out with the wonderful examples that Alvin's been able to show us today. One can only think of Heraclitus, you cannot step into the river twice, and this sort of thing, but the grounding it in the practices of everyday mediation of the spirit is something that I think is worth reading and rereading in Alvin's book. So, words taken from the book: retransmission, reinvention. The digital display is the next step in this kind of thinking. And listening to Alvin, I wasn't quite sure where we stood I've got 3 minutes and I will finish absolutely on time, but I wanted to consider this a little bit and perhaps open this up as a possible thing we might want to discuss. Listening to Alvin talk about the digital as an extension. It's an extension of the body, and the body itself was also an extension in some way. So we've got a kind of series of prosthetic extensions that begin where? Well, either nowhere or everywhere. What is it that is circulated? And how does this circulation embody whatever that is? And this is why I think of it as a phenomenology of spirit for the 21st century. It's the meaning of the word spirit for us, and the German meanings of the word that Alvin talks about, like in a very knowledgeable way, what is meant by Geist, but also the translation into what it might mean in various translations into Chinese. We're dealing with something here where the traditional center of gravity of knowledge, which was always Europe, has now shifted, and in this book in particular, is shifted into Southeast Asia, but not Southeast Asia as a center of gravity, but Southeast Asia as a space where one begins to think these questions through very differently. And I think I've probably reached the end of what I can say here, but I wanted to finish with that point. The relationship between the digital as an extension of the body, which is itself an extension of what we call spirit, with every move, with every act, with every indexical act, as I understand the digital in Alvin's explanation of it, but worked out in the spaces where one must find it. So for me, Taiwan was where I began to think seriously about Alvin's project. Singapore, where Alvin worked it out in its details. I'm going to finish there. Thank you.
Thank you.
I will ask Professor Goh to give his comments on the book as well.
Right. I wrote my notes last night because I was having quite a bit of problem trying to figure out what I'm going to say, because I have a lot of things to say. I actually read the book while Parliament is in session. I probably shouldn't be saying this on record. And it kept me awake, but not in the chamber, because I was in the members' room, in the library actually, watching the debate as I read the book, and it kept me awake very well. I love the book. I think the ethnography is great. The theoretical analysis is refreshing, especially for me as a sociologist, as an anthropologist who dabbles into the study of religion. It has given me a very brand new way of looking at Chinese religion, and attending a lot of 7-month dinners this month because of my political role actually. Yes, open up vistas of knowledge and insights. So I'm kind of sandwiched between two experts, one on cultural theory, and he has not filled my expectations, Professor John Phillips, and an expert on Chinese religion. So it's very difficult for me to say anything that could match what they were going to say. So I decided to focus on ghosts, which is kind of appropriate. So the first point I want to make, I think, is that when I read the book, the constant invocation of Derrida is more than a haunting, right? Derrida is ever present in this book. Also brought up and invoked the ghost of Derrida in my own mind when I first encountered him in the 1990s in the Spectres of Marx. Because then I was I was fascinated with Marx, and which actually made me switch into social science and to do sociology. Spectres of Marx, and the book has actually quite interestingly gave me a new insight to the Spectres of Marx, and to see Derrida as actually a Taoist. And not just a continental philosopher. I mean, what was he trying to do? He was saying that, okay, communism has collapsed, right? And so that actually has freed up Marx, right, and his ideas, and all the different Marxisms are now proliferating like little deities, spirits into the Western discourse. And as a deconstructionist, he's taking all these little Marxisms and trying to launch a kind of new international, which is kind of like a pantheon, a Taoist pantheon of all the different Marxisms. So as long as you have some Marxism, or you believe in some kind of Marxism, you can then therefore join this new international and lead, and participate in some kind of new kind of revolution that is not transcendent And that is the key point, and this kind of follows up from John's point about the everyday. It is something that's very imminent. It's about imminent, daily, everyday problems of inequality, of state indebtedness that's translated into everyday inequalities and so on and so forth. That was Derrida's point. So it's brilliant in the sense. Let me then move on to another goals, and the other one is this particular goals that I've been dealing with or trying to engage in my own work, and which I find carefully avoided, but quite deafening in Alvin's work. And this is the avoidance of post-colonial theory as we know it, all right, and Orientalism and so on and so forth. Right? So the absence of a critique of the category of religion, for example, and the attempt to decenter Western philosophy, right, by importing Derrida onto Taoism. So I see Taoism being interpreted through Derrida's words, which to a scholar who has been engaging in post-colonial studies is somewhat creates a discomfort, right? Because it's kind of like a Western frame being used on Taoist practices and Taoist beliefs. But I find it actually quite interesting and again refreshing. Why? Because I think post-colonial theory has reached a stage where it has maybe a kind of I won't call it hegemonic, but at least an obsession for many scholars in Asia. All the words like decolonial, deimperial, Asia as method, and so on and so forth. So there is a need, I think, also to think about how and why we are holding on to these post-colonial concepts, especially when we want to do our own studies on our own societies, our own cultures, or cultures that are neighboring to us. So I don't find the lack of post-colonial critique particularly problematic, but I think it raises, I think, an interesting specter, which is, if we go back to Derrida, it's a specter of the Enlightenment being freed up, since the Western civilization is collapsing, right, and Asia is on the rise, and perhaps all these little, all these great philosophers, of the Enlightenment are now being freed up as spirits for us to appropriate, and why not, right? Why not appropriate Derrida to look at Taoism in Singapore? Why not? But how do we do it, and what do we do with it? I think this book is a very good example, very nice example of how we can use a continental philosophy that I never thought would be used on Taoism, to use it to analyze and see how the practices kind of worked out into the kind of abstraction, and it links up as John said, the different realms very well. Right, the different realms of the everyday to the digital to the very grounded analysis. Chapter 3, by the way, is the most, in anthropological terms, most amic, in a sense that it's written from the perspective of the Taoist practices and the worldview itself. And I found concepts like orature, which is developed from within the kind of Afro-Asian knowledge networks that people have been looking at Africa and Asian religious practices to be particularly useful. And I found that chapter actually to be the less Derridian, right? And I thought it was quite interesting because it's you move from Derrida and you go into the ground and then you move back to Derrida and what is that? How does one make sense of that disjuncture in a particular chapter, right? The other thing is that I thought that Alvin himself is doing a performance through this book. And he's equally possessed, right? He's channeling in some ways Derrida, right? But I find that the possession is not enough. Right? He's not fully possessed. He should learn more from the spirit idioms and to practice, a deeper kind of possession. And reach the stage of Uncle Cheong's Godfather, right, where he's in 80 years old, in which he doesn't have to quote Derrida anymore, but he basically possesses the spirit of Derrida and perhaps post-Derrida or whatever. But, it's not about voice. Voice is about transcendence. I'm asking for possession, right? So, if you understand what I mean. And the chapter on Christianity, there's a chapter on Christianity here, I felt, it was too modest, right, on his part. Perhaps coming from his own background, if he's going to do a spirit mediumship and bring it into Christianity, because I understand Alvin is Christian, right? So, and that,
maybe there's a certain reticence, perhaps. Yeah. But I felt he was a bit too modest, right? At least in engaging with the existing theoretical work on religion, not in Singapore, but around the world, in which actually a lot of the themes like mediation, abstraction, and the problem of presence is a key issue. So works like Matthew and Gail Kay's Problem of Presence, Joel Robbins' Becoming Sinners, Webb Keane, who was just here, Christian Moderns, these works are quite interesting because they are kind of dealing with quite the same issues. And these issues are popping up in African, South American, Asian context, which is very related to this. And of course, some Christian theologians have been talking quite a bit about the link between Pentecostalism and Asian kind of folk religion worship. So that link, I think, is a very productive thing. And of course, it's something that you can kind of develop as a project as you go on. Yeah. What else do I have to say? Right. So your possession is not enough, but I do wonder, of course, whether being a spirit medium in academia actually works. Because we are, I think, always called to be bodhisattvas more than anything. And so it's more like a Buddhist complex here. And if you bring Taoism in and become a spirit medium, I'm not sure about the effects of that and how it will affect your tenure and promotion and whatnot. Right? So I'll leave it as that. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much. I have written out a few comments, and I'll try to get through them in the time allotted. Alvin Lim's Digital Spirits in Religion and Media, Possession and Performance is not for the faint-hearted, as you may have gathered from the last two comments. The book stages a serious and sustained encounter with spirit medium possession performances in Singapore, as well as a critique of evangelical Christian churches and a reflection on their Christmas pageants. The book also explores the digital realm as an increasingly important form of the mediation of religion. Clearly, we're now living in an age of the mediation of an age of the digital proliferation of ritual performance. Lim's theoretical framework is an extension of the deconstructive method of Jacques Derrida, as well as the theories of the production and sacrifice of excess in the general economy of Bataille. And he's fascinated by the endlessly proliferating traces of the spiritual in the bodies and gestures of spirit mediums, their translators, their ritual artifacts, and the transfers of text and images to digital platforms. In the end, he responds to the call of Levinas to move beyond the trace to the face-to-face encounter with the other as an ethical imperative. He takes seriously Bruno Latour's call to include spiritual beings or forces in the assembly of the social. His chapter 2 explores the phenomenon of excess in Chinese popular religious spirit possession events through a dialogue with an assistant to a spirit medium, Uncle Chung. In this chapter, he quotes Derrida on the unthinkable within the Western tradition, the coexistence of, I quote, the erased and the traced of the trace. Derrida is critiquing the limits of the Western tradition based in Greek thought and Judeo-Christian transcendental monotheism. And Lim argues that it's necessary to move beyond Derrida's fixation with the loss of the sacred aura in the imitation of the Platonic copy, as he seeks to loosen the restrictive formulation of religion from an Abrahamic gaze and to develop a more nuanced understanding of the performativity of deities and how mediums mediate and reproduce spirit presence. His emphasis is on the efficacy of performance. And he has 4 hypotheses, that, which he didn't read yet, so I'll read them for you. And think of mediums here, not just as spirit mediums, but all kinds of mediums, digital, other forms, paper, whatever, artifacts, talismans. Mediums constitute our everyday encounter with spirits, without which no relation can be established with a spiritual being. For example, the spirit mediums described in this book, who are themselves the vessels of spiritual beings, simultaneously use other objects to act as spiritual vessels as well. Number 2, mediums direct, transform, alter, and entangle other mediums, representations, forms, and signs. They interact with each other, and these interactions are able to convey a message and at the same time alter it. Number 3, mediums are also traces. One of the reasons the study of religions is a partial account of reality is because mediums draw on mnemonic reserves, memory and tradition, including patterned movements made and remembered by bodies. They perform a genealogy of both concrete and loose associations. And finally, number 4, mediums intervene as intermediaries in the theatrical form of a lived theater. Now, in this chapter, he makes a good case that Zhuangzi was also a deconstructionist. And yet, Derrida's 70 books reveal that the struggle to deconstruct the Western philosophic tradition is an endless task, one that has spread to Singapore and Southeast Asia with the spread of Christianity as the conversion to modernity. I'd suggest that Zhuangzi is not only deconstructive, but also hints at a productive and even an ecstatic mode of acceptance of death as emerging with the cosmos, and also the possibility of merging with the powers of the immortals. Thus, another way of thinking excess in Chinese popular religion would be in terms of a positive unconscious, which is productive of excess, ignores contradictions, and works like dream to stage an intensive affective environment. In Chapter 2, Corporeal Gods, on the monkey spirit, Mr. Wu, Alvin discusses Eliade's concept of shamanism, which he finds wanting in relation to the Singaporean data. Edward Davis wrote a book called Society and the Supernatural in the Song, 2001, which drew a sharp distinction between shamans who controlled their own spirit journeys through the cosmos, often with an animal familiar, as in some cases of Siberian shamanism, and the phenomenon of possession of mediums by a god or a spirit, in which the original personality is replaced by that of the god, or the persona of the god. In the latter variety, the movements, the voice, the demeanor of the possessed medium are transformed. Davis's study also helps us look at the change between religious Taoism and their relationship with spirit mediums. To oversimplify this story, early Taoist movements in the 2nd to 3rd century CE rejected the state sacrificial cult and the bloody sacrifices of the spirit medium-led local cults in the name of new, purer heavenly realms and powers conveyed by Lord Lao Tzu. But by the Song dynasty, many more compromises were established between Taoist masters and local temple-based spirit mediums. By the late imperial period, Taoist masters had divided into those who performed complex rites of cosmic renewal and those who performed martial rites of exorcism and protection, often directing spirit mediums in the performance of those rituals. The Song also saw a proliferation of new ritual methods for transforming the Taoist master into a deity, called Bianshan, transforming the body. This is, however, a carefully controlled process, drawing on internal visualization of the microcosmic body that transforms like a Mobius strip into the macrocosmic pantheon. In the case of spirit mediums, these procedures have been radically simplified. Now, in Fujian or Taiwan, where the culture is primarily monocultural Minnan Hokkien, spirit mediums are kept in place by local power structures, including the powerful local lineages and the hierarchy of troops of Taoist masters. But in Singapore, local culture is fragmented and multiple, and there's much more space for the performances of spirit mediums. In the chapter 4 on the 9 Emperors, I should also mention that chapter quotes and sort of critiques Judith Butler on ritual as a machine of the formation of subjectivity. But the challenge of spirit possession is that there's a kind of force or persona from the outside, the radical outside, that enters in and creates an interiority deeper than subjectivity. So I think that still is a difficult question to explore. In Chapter 4 on the 9 Emperor Gods in Chuatsugang, there are many fascinating questions about the ubiquitous roles of smartphones, videos, and drones in these events. I've decided that smartphones have replaced incense as a sign of respect to the gods. And there's the afterlife of all these events on digital platforms of all kinds. This chapter explores the roles of Bagua, hexagrams of the I Ching, as early models of computational language. And I totally agree that Taoist ritual is highly computational, that it moves beyond the persistence of traces, beyond the live enactments of the gods in ritual. I'd argue that such ritual events stage a rebooting of the cosmos, and that ritual has the power to transform and shape social groups beyond cultural boundaries and state-imposed limits. Chapter 5 discusses this tragic case of a suicide you mentioned in your talk today, and one of his friends in 2008. They made a suicide pact believing they could return as slayers to battle demons and hasten the end of the world. He explores the role of online games like World of Warcraft and Slayers on this group of friends, and argues that the young spirit medium was drawn to the lure of digital immortality within these online worlds. Obviously, this is in a very extreme case. which is not typical of the vast majority of spirit medium performances around Singapore. As we know from the fallout from that case, which he mentions in the chapter, many spirit mediums broke away at that time from the Taoist Association, precisely because they considered the latter to represent the interests of the larger temples, whereas they were mostly performing services to individuals out of their own HDB flats. If we consider that there were over 200 kampong in Singapore in the 1960s, and each had probably 3 to 4 temples, then we can understand that many temples transferred to the house altars of their spirit mediums when villagers were scattered into the HDBs. We've located over 800 temples in Singapore, and there are reliable reports of over 1,000 spirit medium altars in the HDBs. I suppose that every day several hundred people get possessed, go into trance in Singapore. Thus, it's an extremely widespread phenomenon that deserves careful interdisciplinary study, and Alvin should be thanked for his profound and thoughtful study of it. I'll just make a few more comments. This chapter also discusses the theory of ritual brought forward by Seligman, Weller, Hewitt, and Simon in Ritual and Its Consequences. That's an interesting book, published in 2008 by Oxford Press. He notes that it presents a tragic theory of ritual as an endless process of performances designed to fix a broken world. This contains, actually, from Michael Puett, a profound insight into one strand of early Chinese cosmological thinking. In that view, the world is full of potentially dangerous spirits, including ancestors. Ritual is a constant effort to keep them satisfied and supportive, but it's a human effort in which one has to perform one's sincerity. As such, it's a profoundly sociological insight into the functional role of ritual. However, there's another strand of Chinese cosmological thinking right from the start that emphasizes the potential for self-divinization. This would lead to Taoist forms of inner alchemy and ritual self-transformation. And yet, I'd also argue there was a third strand of ritual experience, less thought out but still widespread, featuring possession by gods and spirits. The spirit medium's possession is one pole of a charged field of forces of a larger ritual event, the other pole occupied by the controlled ritual actions of the Taoist master. In Singapore, however, we're more familiar with rites carried out with only minimal involvement from Taoist masters. The stage is occupied by the spirit mediums of the gods. These sessions recall the comment of Marcel Mauss in his essay Techniques of the Body, that I think there are necessarily biological means of entering into communication with God. I think Lim is right to suggest that the model of ritual in Seligman et al. Is not adequate to take on the exuberant excess of events, such as the 9 emperor gods he showed some images of today. Instead, he notes the power of repetition and excess. What are we hearing out there? The constant transfer of traces of the spiritual into talismans, paper money, prayers, god statues, endless pantheons, digital forms of the rites. This recalls the comments of Gilles Deleuze on ritual as difference for itself and difference in itself, continually self-differentiating in each repetition. That understanding of ritual evokes a kind of abstract machine in which the powers of the gods are suspended in a metastable state between heaven and earth. These powers are virtual but real, and they are actualized through the descent of the gods into the spirit mediums, where the powers become a vector moving through the multitude in a generative flow of blessings, cures, and lottery ticket numbers. Here we're speaking about the productive force of ritual events, and not only the tracing of endlessly disappearing traces of the spiritual. To develop this perspective, we would need even more accounts of the micro-performances of spirit mediums and of participants of all kinds, a new micro-sociology of ritual events. In Chapter 5, Alvin turns his attention to Christian Christmas performances in Singapore and criticizes the digital showmanship of evangelical pastors, such as Kong Hee of City Harvest Church, currently serving a 6-year prison term. But in his own account of his work in directing a Christmas performance for the Gospel Light Christian Church, he argues that there's a need to accept a degree of profanation. Hold on, last page, I hope. Oh, missing page. It's the profanation. Well, I may have to make it up as I go along. Yeah, so, I wonder if I left it. Hold on, I'll see if I can find it. A degree of profanation that comes with performance and access to digital platforms. You have to make these compromises in order to further spread the Christian message. I think I got that right. This chapter is fascinating in its explicit critique of some of the mega-evangelical churches and their televangelists. However, I felt that there could have been more discussion of phenomenon such as the speaking in tongues, in light of the detailed analysis of the role of the Tuoto spirit medium assistant and translator in the earlier chapters. The analysis of Christian rites or mediatized sermons could have been taken further as well, but this is perhaps the promise of another study. In his final chapter, Alvin playfully proposes the term #ECCESS, excess, to gesture simultaneously towards coding languages and to access to modes of excess. I quote, "Every time I visit a procession, I witness and participate in a relentless archiving of the practice. While I may not and cannot believe in the Taoist gods, there is still the belief of the labor, the intensity, and the poignancy of the people deeply rooted in their practice. There is a collective experience beyond just the moment of spiritual enactment and a shared and fragmented history. I am desperate to uncover the surface of things, of origins and originals, but to no avail. I can only speak of their traces. Archiving is one of the ways of expressing this contradiction between preservation and loss." I'd like to thank Alvin for a courageous and passionate study, an encounter with the other, both within Chinese spirit medium culture and within the divided Christian community of Singapore. This book enriches our understanding, and it calls for further engagement with its underlying problematic, the quest for meaning in a digital age. Thank you very much. I think we now can open up for questions and discussion. We have about half an hour, and the author is right here, and we'll leave some time for book signing and those kinds of ceremonies towards the end of the question and answer period. So please feel free to raise any questions you may have. Yes, please.
Are we supposed to stand?
It's up to you. It's okay.
Okay, just into the microphone.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Alvin and everyone. It's such a pleasure to hear about your work. As a theater studies colleague, and I don't know much about your subject at all, what I'm interested in hearing from you is how your work in theater and performance studies, what is it about this perspective do you feel adds to the discussion of spirit mediums, of religion in Singapore, of Asian spirit mediums, and things like this? Of course, I'm very curious to know what you think is the way in which your perspective is quite new, and what it adds to the discourse.
I'm going to re-borrow, because I think I talk about ghosts and haunting in my book. I'm going to re-borrow Daniel's point about ghosts. And actually, I'm very informed by this very seminal work by Marvin Carson, right? Hauntings. And one of the points that he makes that whenever we watch someone on stage, right, we're not just watching the character, you're not just spectating the character, but you're also spectating the actor. So there's this kind of duality that always happens when so I kind of extrapolate from that, kind of export that idea into my own work. So when I say, for example, in chapter 3, I look at a spirit medium. So I'm conscious that I'm not just looking at the spirit, the spirit that is possessed the body, but I'm also looking at the spirit medium and how that in itself, because a lot of kind of discourse about spirit possessions is about how the body gets possessed, goes into trance, but there's no talk about how the body itself restricts the god, the deity, in a way that such that so Mr. Wu, for example, cannot do what a monkey god is supposed to do. Instead, that monkey god is restricted in that particular body. So I'm looking at a lot of these examples. So a lot of the kind of vocabulary terminologies I learned from my theatre studies background gets featured. And there's a way I think John talks about this very well. I mean, more eloquently than I can possibly do so. Which is that I'm looking at the theatricality as a medium, and that the ways in which spirit possessions or the use of digital technology are theatrical events, theatrical acts that always simultaneously show both the character, or the use kind of the character-actor sort of duality. So that's my kind of brief, immediate response to your question, but thank you for that question.
Hi, thank you so much for a really interesting presentation. So this topic is new to me, but my interest is in audiences. So I'm wondering who consumes these videos, why do they consume it, how do the videos, or how does their accessibility, repeatability, transferability affect the way that the gods are perceived as more or less real, more or less divine? So I'm just interested in the audience response to these pieces of media and how it plays into the religion and how it's perceived and participated in.
I must confess that when I first started, thank you for your question, when I first started, there weren't a lot of viewers, or like we're talking about, there's like 40, 50 people. At one time, maybe there's only like 10 likes when someone posts, because it was not prevalent at the time. So in a way, I was anticipating what was going to happen. So right now, I find, for example, I've noticed there's a very strong network of audience viewership in, say, for the recent Guild High performance, where at one point they had 200,000 viewers.
Wow.
So it was, I think, some of you in the audience might actually know this whole incident where, so there's a company who is in charge of like live streaming such performances, and what happens during these performances is that you not just see the kind of entertainment on stage, right? It's really like a theatrical event, but you also, sometimes the camera pans to the deities who are also watching the performance. So the performance is not just for humans, it's also like the first row is kept. But in this particular example, so one of the host was complaining, well, you're all there to sit in front. It's actually for the spirits. But because it was so popular, Third Time has become very, very popular form in Singapore, and so there are a lot of viewers. But I would say that that's kind of a recent phenomenon. So I was looking at more at private temples. But what has happened is that because private temples have started to use live streaming a lot, or as they use, before that they were already kind of generating a lot of interest in it, because there was a whole new group of a young generation of videographers who followed the practices, who volunteered to carry the palanquins, for example, and they became interested and they took it upon themselves to be like the documenters. They would do the documentary and put that online. So there's a sort of like a small network of the younger generation with their WhatsApp groups that tell, okay, let's go for this festival, let's go for this. So I'm noticing a sort of small network that is forming, but I think it's kind of expanded over the years. So that's why I feel the need to kind of do a second book, because I don't think this book has kind of paid justice to that recent kind of explosion of like interest in such religious practices.
Alvin, you mentioned in your chapter on the 9 emperor gods that the videos are being consulted for the next year's performance. That there's a kind of a looping back effect also on, and also it's probably spreading of possibilities and competitive performance across. For the 9 emperor gods, there are 16 temples performing simultaneously, but now everybody can see what the others.
Right. Okay. That's another example I would like to share, because so one particular temple called Longnan Tian, they invited the Prime Minister, and it was a big splash on Facebook. So the Prime Minister is here, and the Prime Minister himself used his Facebook page to promote. But instead of showing the spirit mediums, what he did instead was to show the fireworks. So he was quite clear that he wasn't there to promote the religion. Right? But they appropriated this whole event to sort of promote, and I think the other temples then caught on as what Professor Dean was talking about. They caught on, and subsequently, I find, for example, a lot of temples try to post like their events with ministers. So it's a sort of recognition that I'm a legitimate temple because a minister or MP attends my annual events. So yeah.
That makes me think of the situation in Taiwan, where starting with Zhang Jingguo towards the end of his life, he started attending a lot of the big rituals, and now it's absolutely essential, and a lot of the candidates at all the elections appear at all these events. And now even Matsu has informed a certain candidate that he has to run for KMT leadership. Yes, sorry, I think Fabian's hand was up first, and then, yeah.
Great, thank you. That was fascinating. When you were talking about the Monkey King, you came out with a nice sentence. The digital technology multiplies the presence of the God. It is really thought-provoking. Taking, for example, a good movie. I like Brad Pitt. I think he's a great actor. I like all of his movies. You could equally say that a good Brad Pitt movie multiplies the presence of Brad Pitt, because his face is everywhere. It's on digital movie screens everywhere. You could also say, using the same logic, that your book, which is, I assume, available online, multiplies the presence of Alvin Lim. And of course, you were talking about the monkey god when you said this, and it was a book, Journey to the West, which multiplied the presence of the Monkey King himself in Chinese religion. So my question is, how does your statement, I'm not sure how it figures in your book because I haven't read the book, but how does your statement that digital technology multiplies the presence for God add anything to our understanding of gods or spirits themselves?
I guess the reason why that was sort of a simplification of what I actually sort of tried to explain in my book. But what I was very interested in trying to sort of at least document was this whole sort of process. I mean, it always intrigued me that for example, in Hogang Dong you only have the first brother as being kind of represented, and yet Chua Chu Kang Dong is always kind of deemed as they have the 9 spirit mediums that can embody. So what I'm very interested in is that how is it that this god can be split into or multiplied into, and yet at each instance of its performance, of its possession, it's still deemed as a divine being, as the main sort of deity that is being worshipped, as being that's performed around. So what I wanted to really kind of try to explain was that the question is not so much whether the God is present. That's why I think the focus was more on the efficacy, and so I was looking at how each event in itself is efficacious insofar as there are a group of people, there are participants, and the God himself is active in performing together with all these different modes of mediation. But I was also trying to capture also that sense that okay, if we compare across, if you look at say a YouTube page and then we see that there are multiple versions of Monkey God or multiple versions of Nine Emperor Gods, what does that create in effect? Are we looking at the ways in which people then try to compare and match I'm more real than you? Because some of the kind of on the ground discourse that actually this young person who is embodying or being possessed is a fake, is a fraud instead. So there's a sort of this kind of to and fro. So the self-critiquing, it becomes for me a very kind of meta-theatrical sort of moment whenever I hear stories about that sort of multiplication.
Yeah, but it seems like you're assuming that before digital media, there was a total unawareness of spirit mediums, that other people were channeling the same God.
No, I think the point my book was...
That's incorrect. Of course, other people were aware the God was being channeled. It's also within Chinese cosmology that the spirit is divisible. Even in humans, it divides after death into 3, and deities having larger amounts of spirit energy multiply in their divisibility. So there was already this awareness.
Yeah, I agree. I think I covered that in my book as well. But I think what I'm saying is also, precisely because of the introduction or the intervention of digital technology, there's a whole generation of like new spirit mediums who actually don't understand, and so they kind of think by looking and watching these videos, they have gained some sort of access to that practice. So I'm looking at both in terms of how the kind of the philosophies or the kind of cosmologies within Taoism that already informs that possibility that the gods can divide, and multiply. But I'm also looking in the ways in which, with the introduction of digital technology, there's also performances and misinterpretations or multiplication of what is actually not the god itself, but actually sort of fraud performance, a misperformance of a monkey god, for example. But thank you very much for the questions.
Hi, good afternoon. I really appreciate your comments. Very stimulating discussion and the presentation. I am coming from the media side, and it's interesting, of course, to talk about media possession. Of course, in my biased view, the media possesses you, not the other way around. So we're coming from the two related questions. One is that you mentioned how it's kind of theoretical, and I think that was a theme that seems to run through in the discussion as well. So if you think of it being theoretical, then there's a tendency to perform to the medium. So I'm wondering to what extent this seems to have happened, or seems to be happening more, because if you say that it's going more digital, then the tendency to perform to that medium. So that's one. And secondly, the history of media is that media undermines authority, including like bringing on the Catholic Church 50 years after the invention of the printing press in Europe. So I'm wondering to what extent, and this may not be a fair question, it's maybe we are too ahead of our time, but to what extent do you see media undermining authority in these temples and in these religions?
I'll just quickly respond to the second question. So you're trying to think about the first. In an explicit example, so for example, the use of the drones, because a lot of these nine pro-gods temples, what happens is that they are forced to go to the outskirts of Singapore, like along the coastal areas, and most of them end up, so Choa Chu Kang Temple, for example, is forced all the way to Tuas, when in fact, because of reclamation, because as our island expands, they are forced nearer and nearer. So whenever I take a picture of Choa Chu Kang Tempo's possessions, I get this sort of backdrop of chemical plants. And there's no escape from sort of authorities, because when they do possessions, what happens is then the Cisco police, traffic police will also be there, and they will guide them and make sure that they can only kind of parade in a very specific lane of the road, so that some roads are still open. And so each time a parade is performed, they also have to apply for a police permit. So there's always that level of sort of governance. But what I find interesting is that sort of to negotiate with that sort of governance and control, what a lot of temples do is then let's bring a drone, and we create a sort of clip. That's why the reason why I showed that clip is to show them that there's this sort of like micro ways that they do to sort of negotiate with this, like being pushed to the outskirts, being pushed to be sort of not visible. But what they are doing increasingly is to make themselves more visible. And that's why I think out of all the different sort of practices, Taoist practices, I think Nine Pro-Gods is like one of the most successful, besides because it engages and uses technology in a very creative in a very creative way. So, do you mind just repeating the first question, because I
So actually, you misunderstood my second question. My second question was not authority of the government, but authority of the religion itself. So the printing press undermined the authority of the Catholic Church itself. The printed word undermined the authority of elders. So the media tends to undermine authority in this sense. So I guess undermine the authority of the temples or the religion in particular. The first question was whether people perform, and in fact you kind of answered that. You're saying that they use drones, which wasn't part of the religion before, and part of now, I don't know if it's part of worship or not, but it's now part of the whole ceremony. So in fact you are saying that they are using technology and making a performance as opposed to part of a worship, right? Am I right?
Yes,
so
yes.
Whether using technology now to make it even more theatrical. Theatrical.
Alvin, I didn't know if we should give you a chance to respond to any of the comments that came earlier, if you'd like to do that, given the break.
For me, I was very nervous at the start because this book or this project has never had a proper audience, and I never actually got to hear what Professor Phillips thought about my book, and in a more kind of in a more critical or like, because he's always very supportive of me. So to hear him today speak so eloquently about my book, I'm very humbled and honored that he was there to guide me along. Just to quickly respond to Daniel's point about ghosting, I think I was very conscious. I tried to do that. In fact, I was removing my sources. I wasn't trying to quote explicitly the reader, but I think one of the points that I think in one of our conversations with Professor Phillips, I think we talk about how this project that there is a place for playfulness, and there's also a place where you want to have a proper conversation with different disciplines and different areas of research. So I wanted at least sort of to engage in, because I'm trained in theatre, but I also read a lot of continental philosophy. But I didn't want to just reject that because I want to be post-colonial. I want to write back. I want to write being more smarter than those dead people. So instead, most of the people that I quote are dead. So in a way, yes, I'm haunting them. So what would it look like to actually try to embody them in some ways, but still engage in sort of academic sort of register, and to use that sort of register to still make sense of my of the practices that I write about. And so I think this is a product of my struggle, the challenge to be, like you said, like I almost felt like I was like one chapter I'm a monkey god, the next chapter I'm Emperor god, and then one chapter I'm actually an orc in Warcraft. And so there is sort of that splitting of like my own sort of character, and I think that taught me a lot about my own religion as well. And so for example, I no longer go to church because of this project. Because it exposed certain things I kind of already knew that was boiling within like a lot of these churches and denominations that I go to. But that's not to say that I completely reject Christianity. I think what this has taught me instead to be closer to my own religion, because it's made me realize that at the core of it, it's also our own struggle to be connected to our own sort of beliefs. And I think I find that more real and more rewarding. And I hope this book I kind of move on from this book, to be frank, but one can never really move on from what you've written. But I'm in a new space in thinking about, not in terms of hauntings, but also in terms of I'm no longer haunted by this book, but rather I'm going to take up your challenge. I'm going to try to be possessed. I'm not by the reader himself, but what happens when I possess what is the trace of myself in this book.
I have a question. I just want to know what are the fundamental differences between the digital spirits and those deities presented in the non-digital forms. Do you have any ideas? Thank you.
This is both a simple and yet very complex question, if I may. I think what I'm looking at precisely is, I think what I'm trying to kind of avoid saying in my book is not just like to say that I'm just looking at digital technology. Because in one of my explanations in my first chapter is to explain that being digital is not so much using digital technology, but actually if you look at the root word of digital, I'm looking at the ways in which, so for example, digit or to dig is actually is a corporal gesture. It's like you point to something abstract in order to point that this is something that is present. So I'm using that as a kind of understanding of. So in a way, what I'm arguing is that actually even sort of traditional spirit possessions are in themselves digital. I'm trying to equate that being spiritual actually means to be digital. So, but I understand where the question comes from, because there's a way to kind of still separate, like you're looking at very kind of private, where there's really just you, a devotee, and the spirit medium and the total. But already in the arrangement, right? The arrangement between the temple assistant, the spirit medium, the god, and as well as the person who is asking for like the lottery number, then in itself is a kind of digital circulation. Because what I mean is that then there's several gestures pointing to this abstract idea: will I strike my lottery? Will my health recover? But what I find very interesting is then it's not. For me, I don't try to make like clear distinction between digital technology or technology, because for me, the technology in itself is not so much like the gadgets that we talk about, but actually technology is, this root word is also, it means craft. It's also the craft, the practice of whether it's artistic practice or whether it's theatre, whether it's religion. It involves accumulation of techniques in order to achieve some form of efficacious performance. I hope I answered your question.
If there are no more questions, we maybe can leave time for Alvin to sign copies of the book, which we recommend that you have a look at. If you haven't had a chance to look through it, this is a good opportunity. And if you're interested, you can pick up a copy here at a greatly reduced price. Please join me in thanking Alvin for this presentation today, and also thanking the speakers who came along to come.